My name is Melissa Turner. I'm 34 years old, and on the day I buried the man I loved more than life itself, my own sister shattered what remained of my broken heart with a revelation that still haunts me to this day. The morning of Benjamin's funeral dawned gray and merciless over our little town of Whitmore, Montana. November had always been cruel here, but that particular Thursday felt like the earth itself was mourning. I stood at my bedroom window, still wearing yesterday's clothes, watching the frost cling stubbornly to the bare branches of the oak tree Ben had planted when we first moved into this house 12 years ago. He'd been so proud of that tree, talking about how our children would climb it someday, how we'd hang a tire swing from its strongest branch, children that never came, dreams that died with him 3 days earlier when that drunk driver ran the red light on Highway 89. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and let the tears fall freely. In a few hours, I'd have to be strong for everyone else. I'd have to shake hands and accept condolences and pretend I wasn't completely destroyed inside. But for now, in the quiet of our bedroom that still smelled like his cologne and coffee, I allowed myself to break apart completely. "Mel, you need to start getting ready, honey." My mother's voice drifted up from downstairs, gentle but insistent. Mom had driven down from Billings the moment she got my call, and she'd been my anchor ever since. Without her, I probably would have curled up in bed and never gotten up again. "I'll be down in a minute," I called back, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. I turned away from the window and caught my reflection in the dresser mirror. God, I looked terrible. My honey blonde hair hung limp and unwashed. Dark circles shadowed my green eyes, and my skin had taken on a sickly pale cast. Ben would have hated seeing me like this. He always said I was most beautiful when I smiled, that my whole face lit up and made him feel like the luckiest man alive. I'd never smile the same way again. The black dress I'd chosen hung on the closet door like an accusation. I'd bought it for my college roommate's wedding last spring, never imagining I'd be wearing it to my husband's funeral before the year was out. Life has a twisted sense of irony sometimes. As I mechanically went through the motions of getting dressed, my mind wandered to all the arrangements I'd had to make over the past 3 days. The funeral home, the flowers, the cemetery plot, the reception afterward at the church hall. Everyone kept asking what Ben would have wanted, as if I had some secret handbook for navigating widowhood at 34. The truth was, Ben and I had never talked about death. We were young, invincible, planning for decades together. We had wills, sure, basic documents our lawyer had drawn up when we bought the house, but nothing elaborate. Everything went to the surviving spouse, simple and clean, or so I thought. I was fastening my grandmother's pearl necklace when I heard car doors slamming in the driveway. Through the bedroom window, I saw my sister Laura's silver BMW pulling up behind Mom's rental car. Even at my husband's funeral, Laura couldn't resist making an entrance. Laura Turner had always been the dramatic one in our family. 2 years younger than me, she'd been blessed with the kind of striking beauty that turned heads and opened doors. Dark hair, blue eyes, and a figure that she maintained religiously at the gym, where I'd chosen quiet stability, marrying my college sweetheart, working as a librarian, living a simple life in a small town. Laura had chased excitement and wealth in Seattle. She'd never been married, though she'd had plenty of relationships. The longest had been with Marcus Webb, a tech executive who'd left her when she got pregnant with Jason 16 years ago. She'd raised my nephew as a single mother, always bitter about the men who'd disappointed her, always envious of what she saw as my perfect life with Ben. If only she knew how many nights I'd cried myself to sleep, wondering why we couldn't have children, watching Ben try to hide his disappointment every month when the pregnancy test came back negative. Perfect life, indeed. I heard Laura's laugh through the thin walls, that bright, artificial sound she made when she was trying to charm someone, probably introducing herself to the neighbors who'd come to pay their respects. Laura had always been good at working a room, at making herself the center of attention, even when the occasion called for quiet dignity. By the time I made it downstairs, our small living room was filled with people. Mrs. Henderson from next door was arranging a casserole in the kitchen. Ben's co-workers from the construction company stood awkwardly by the fireplace, their work-roughened hands clutching coffee cups like lifelines. My Aunt Patricia had driven down from Canada with her husband Bob, and they were deep in conversation with our pastor, Reverend Mitchell, and there was Laura, holding court by the window, her 16-year-old son Jason standing silently beside her like a shadow. She'd dressed him in an expensive-looking black suit that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Jason had always been a quiet kid, serious beyond his years, and today he looked particularly uncomfortable with all the attention. "Melissa." Laura rushed over the moment she saw me, wrapping me in one of her theatrical hugs. She was wearing a designer black dress that fit her like a glove and heels that were completely inappropriate for walking on cemetery grass. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. Ben was such a good man." I stiffened in her arms. Laura had never particularly liked Ben, had always made little comments about how he wasn't ambitious enough, how I could do better. She'd skipped our wedding 10 years ago, claiming she had food poisoning, though I'd seen the photos on social media of her at a party in Vancouver that same weekend. "Thank you for coming," I managed, pulling away from her embrace. "Of course I came. You're my sister." She squeezed my hands, her perfectly manicured nails digging slightly into my skin. "We need to stick together, especially now." Something in her tone made me look at her more closely. There was an odd gleam in her eyes, a barely contained excitement that seemed wildly inappropriate given the circumstances. But before I could analyze it further, Reverend Mitchell approached us. "Melissa, dear, we should start heading to the church soon," he said gently. "The service is scheduled for 11, and folks will be gathering early." The next hour passed in a blur of condolences and logistics. The funeral procession wound through downtown Whitmore, past the diner where Ben and I had our first date, past the high school where he'd coached youth football on weekends, past all the ordinary places that would never feel the same without him in the world. St. Mark's Episcopal Church was packed. Ben had touched so many lives in our little community, through his work, his volunteering, his quiet kindness to everyone he met. I sat in the front pew, flanked by my mother and Laura, trying to hold myself together as Reverend Mitchell spoke about love and loss and eternal rest. Jason sat on Laura's other side, and I noticed he kept glancing at me throughout the service with an expression I couldn't quite read. The kid had always been perceptive, and I wondered what he was thinking. He'd only met Ben a handful of times over the years, usually during brief holiday visits when Laura deigned to bring him to Montana. The cemetery service was mercifully brief. The November wind cut through our coats as we stood around the grave, and I was grateful when Reverend Mitchell finally said the final prayer. People began to disperse, murmuring about seeing us at the reception, offering final hugs and words of comfort. I was accepting condolences from Ben's supervisor when I heard Laura's voice behind me, louder than it should have been in such a sacred place. "Actually, before everyone leaves, there's something important that needs to be addressed." I turned around, confused. Laura was standing near the grave, holding what looked like a legal document. Jason was beside her, his face pale and unhappy. "Laura, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharp with exhaustion and irritation. "This isn't the time or place." "Oh, but it is the time," she interrupted, her voice carrying across the cemetery with crystal clarity. "Everyone needs to hear this, especially since it affects the future of Ben's estate." The word estate hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications sank in. Around us, people had stopped their quiet conversations and were turning to stare. This was about to become a public spectacle, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. "Laura, please," my mother said, stepping forward with her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Whatever this is about, surely it can wait until after—" "No, it can't wait." Laura's eyes were bright with triumph now, and I realized with growing horror that she'd been planning this moment, probably for days. "You see, everyone assumes that Melissa inherits everything from Ben, but that's not actually true." She held up the document, her voice ringing with false sympathy. "This is Ben's real will, his updated will, and according to this legal document, half of everything he owned rightfully belongs to my son, Jason." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. Around us, our friends and family stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or flee from the family drama unfolding before them. "That's impossible," I whispered. But even as I said it, doubt began creeping into my mind. Ben had been acting strange the past few months, taking phone calls in private, making mysterious trips to town without explaining where he was going. I'd assumed it was just work stress, or maybe he was planning something special for our anniversary next month. "I'm afraid it's very possible," Laura said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "You see, Ben recently discovered something that changed everything. Something that made him realize he had responsibilities beyond just his marriage to you." She paused dramatically, making sure she had everyone's attention. Even Reverend Mitchell had stopped his quiet conversation with the funeral director and was staring at us with an expression of growing alarm. Ben discovered that Jason is his son. The words hung in the cold November air like a curse. Jason is his son. I felt the world tilt sideways, felt my knees threaten to buckle beneath me. Around us, I could hear the sharp intake of breath from the gathered mourners, could feel their eyes boring into me with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. "What did you just say?" My voice came out as barely a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the cemetery, everyone heard it. Laura's smile was triumphant and cruel. "I said Jason is Ben's son, Ben's biological son, and according to this will, dated just 6 weeks ago, he's entitled to half of everything your husband owned." I stared at Jason, searching his face for any resemblance to the man I'd loved and lost. The boy was tall for his age, with sandy brown hair and hazel eyes. He could have been anyone's child. But now that the seed was planted, I found myself looking for similarities that might have always been there. The stubborn set of his jaw, the way he stood with his hands shoved deep in his pockets when he was uncomfortable. "That's impossible," I said again, but my voice lacked conviction. Ben would have told me. He would never have hidden something like that from me. Would he? Laura's voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was steel underneath. "Think about it, Melissa. Really think. Haven't you wondered why you two could never have children? All those years of trying, all those doctor's appointments, all those tests that came back inconclusive? The cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. She was using our deepest pain, our most private struggle, as ammunition in whatever sick game she was playing. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me cry in front of all these people. "Laura, stop," my mother said sharply, moving to stand beside me. "This is neither the time nor the place for these accusations." "They're not accusations, Mom. They're facts." Laura waved the document again. "I have the DNA test results. I have the amended will, and I have a lawyer waiting at the church reception to explain everything properly." A lawyer. Of course she had a lawyer. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment revelation born from grief. This was a calculated attack, planned and executed with military precision. The realization made me feel sick to my stomach. Melissa, Ben's supervisor, Dave Thompson, stepped forward awkwardly. "Maybe we should all head to the reception and let you folks sort this out privately." "No," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "If Laura wants to air this in public, then we'll deal with it in public." I turned to face my sister fully, drawing strength from some deep well of anger I didn't know I possessed. "Show me the DNA test." Laura's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "The results are with my lawyer. Show me the DNA test, Laura. Right now. If you're going to destroy my husband's memory and humiliate me at his own funeral, then you better have rock-solid proof." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Around us, I could hear the whisper of wind through the bare trees, the distant sound of traffic on the highway, the uncomfortable shuffling of feet on frozen ground. Jason was staring at the grass, his face flushed with embarrassment. Whatever game his mother was playing, he clearly wanted no part of it. "The test was done privately," Laura said finally. "Ben arranged it himself after he started having suspicions." "Suspicions about what?" I demanded. "You live in Seattle, Laura. You've visited us maybe 6 times in the past 10 years. When exactly was this alleged affair supposed to have taken place?" 17 years ago, she said smoothly, as if she'd rehearsed this answer. "Right before your wedding, Ben and we had a moment of weakness, a night when you two had that big fight about the bachelor party you didn't want him to have." My blood ran cold. I did remember that fight, one of the worst we'd ever had. Ben had wanted to go to Vegas with his buddies for his bachelor party, and I'd been hurt that he'd rather spend his last days of freedom partying with other women than with me. We'd said terrible things to each other, things we'd both regretted immediately afterward. And Laura had been in town that weekend, ostensibly to help with wedding preparations. She'd stayed at Ben's apartment because our house had been full of out-of-town relatives. I'd been so angry and hurt that I'd gone to stay with my college roommate Sarah for 2 nights, refusing to take Ben's calls. "You're lying," I said, but doubt was creeping in like poison. "Ben would never, not with you." "Wouldn't he?" Laura's voice was soft, almost pitying. "Think about it, Mel. I was young, I was available, and you'd just broken his heart with all that talk about calling off the wedding. Men do stupid things when they're hurt and scared." I wanted to scream, wanted to grab her by the shoulders and shake her until she admitted this was all some sick joke. But deep down, a small voice was whispering that maybe, just maybe, it could be true. Ben had been different when I came back that weekend. More attentive, more apologetic than the situation seemed to warrant. I'd assumed he was just relieved that we'd made up. But what if it was guilt? Even if that were true, I said carefully, it doesn't prove Jason is his son. You could have been with anyone around that time. I wasn't with anyone else, Laura said firmly. Jason was conceived that weekend, and Ben knew it. Why do you think I named him Jason Benjamin Turner? His middle name is Benjamin, Melissa. I've been trying to tell you for years. The name hit me like a thunderbolt. I'd always wondered about Jason's middle name, but Laura had brushed off my questions with vague answers about liking the sound of it. Now the pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. But the timing doesn't work, I said desperately, grasping for anything that would poke holes in her story. Jason is 16. Our wedding was 11 years ago. 11 years ago last month, Laura corrected, and Jason turned 17 last week. Do the math. Melissa, I did the math, and my heart sank. The timeline was perfect, absolutely perfect. If Jason had been born 9 months after that terrible weekend before my wedding, he would be exactly the age he was now. Why are you doing this to me? I whispered, no longer caring who heard. Even if it's true, why now? Why at his funeral? Because Ben was planning to tell you himself, Laura said, and for the first time, her voice carried a note of what might have been genuine emotion. He'd been in contact with me for months, trying to figure out how to break the news. He wanted to do right by Jason, to help with college expenses, to be part of his life, but he was terrified of losing you. The image she painted was so vivid, so believable, that I could almost see it. Ben agonizing over a secret that was eating him alive, trying to find a way to be an honorable man without destroying our marriage. It sounded exactly like something he would do. He died before he could tell you, Laura continued, but Jason deserves his inheritance. He deserves to know his father's family, to have his rightful place in Ben's legacy. His legacy? The words came out sharper than I'd intended. Ben's legacy is 17 years of marriage to me, Laura. 17 years of building a life together, of loving each other through good times and bad. You don't get to waltz in here and rewrite our history because of one night that may or may not have happened. May or may not. Laura's voice rose again, and I realized she was enjoying this, getting some sick satisfaction from my pain. I have documentation, Melissa, DNA results, the amended will, birth records. This isn't speculation. It's fact. Then prove it, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my head. If you have all this documentation, then produce it. Right here. Right now. The papers are at the church with my lawyer. No. I took a step toward her, and she actually backed up slightly. I'm done playing your games, Laura. You want to make these accusations at my husband's funeral? Then you better be prepared to back them up immediately. Not later. Not when it's convenient for you. Right now. The crowd around us had grown silent, hanging on every word. I could see our neighbors and friends exchanging glances, unsure whether to intervene or flee from the family drama. Reverend Mitchell looked like he wanted to crawl into the grave himself, rather than witness this scene. Melissa's right, my mother said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. If you're going to make these claims, Laura, then you need to substantiate them immediately. Otherwise, I suggest you apologize to your sister and let us finish mourning Ben in peace. Laura's jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw something flicker across her face. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. Fine, she said finally. Jason, show her. The boy looked up from the ground with startled, frightened eyes. Mom, I don't. Show her the letter, Jason. The one Ben wrote to you. With trembling hands, Jason reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It looked worn, as if it had been read many times. He held it out to me with obvious reluctance. I'm sorry, Aunt Melissa, he whispered as I took the letter. I didn't know she was going to do this here. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Ben's. I'd seen it on grocery lists and anniversary cards and love notes for over a decade. My eyes scanned the words, and with each line, I felt another piece of my heart break. Dear Jason, I don't know how to begin this letter, or even if I should be writing it at all. Your mother tells me that you've been asking questions about your father, and I suppose you have a right to know the truth. 17 years ago, I made a mistake that has haunted me every day since. I betrayed the woman I loved more than life itself, and the result was you. I'm not proud of what I did, but I can't regret it entirely, because it brought you into the world. You have a right to know your heritage, to understand where you come from. You're smart and kind and everything a father could hope for in a son. I've watched you from afar all these years, and I've been proud of the young man you're becoming. I know this is confusing and probably hurtful. I know you might hate me for not being there, for not being the father you deserved. But please know that not a day has gone by that I haven't thought of you, haven't wondered what kind of man you'd grow up to be. Your Aunt Melissa doesn't know about you yet. I'm still trying to find the courage to tell her. She's a good woman, Jason, better than I deserve, and this knowledge will destroy her. But she deserves the truth, and so do you. I've made arrangements to help with your college expenses and to ensure you're provided for. Your mother has the details. I hope someday you can forgive me for not being brave enough to claim you sooner. With love and regret, Benjamin Clark C.S. There's a photo of you on my desk at work. I tell people you're my nephew, but in my heart, I've always known you were my son. The letter fluttered from my numb fingers to the frozen ground. Around me, the world seemed to tilt and spin, as if the earth itself had shifted off its axis. I thought of Ben's desk at the construction office, tried to remember if I'd ever seen a photo there during my rare visits. Had there been a picture of a teenage boy that I'd dismissed as just another worker's family photo? Melissa? My mother's voice seemed to come from very far away. Honey, are you all right? I wasn't all right. I would never be all right again. The man I'd loved and trusted had spent the last months of his life harboring a secret that changed everything. Not only had he fathered a child with my sister, but he'd been in contact with them, making plans, writing letters, living a double life that I knew nothing about. But worse than the betrayal was the timing. Laura had waited until Ben was dead and buried, until he couldn't defend himself or explain his actions, to make her move. She'd turned his funeral into a circus, humiliated me in front of our entire community, and used our deepest pain as a weapon. The photo, I said suddenly, my voice stronger than I felt. The photo he mentions in the letter. Where is it? Laura blinked, clearly not expecting that question. What? Ben says there's a photo of Jason on his desk at work. Where is it? I turned to Dave Thompson, who was still standing nearby, looking deeply uncomfortable. Dave, you work with Ben every day. Is there a photo of a teenage boy on his desk? Dave shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Well, there might be, Ben had a lot of family photos. Dave, my voice was sharp now, cutting through his stammering. And it's a simple question. Is there or isn't there a photo of Jason on Ben's desk? The silence stretched for several long seconds. Finally, Dave shook his head reluctantly. No, Melissa, there's no photo of Jason on Ben's desk. There are pictures of you, pictures of your wedding, a photo of his parents, but no teenage boys. I felt a surge of something that might have been hope, or maybe just fury. Interesting. Because according to this letter, Ben kept Jason's photo where he could see it every day at work. Laura's face was flushing red now, and she was looking less confident by the minute. Maybe he moved it. Maybe he put it away when he knew he was going to tell you. Or maybe, I interrupted, my voice gaining strength. This letter is a fake. Maybe you wrote it yourself, copying Ben's handwriting from old Christmas cards or birthday notes. That's ridiculous, Laura snapped, but I could hear the defensive edge creeping into her voice. Why would I forge something like that? Money, I said simply. Ben had a good job. We owned our house outright. We had savings and life insurance. You've always struggled financially, always resented what you saw as my comfortable life. What better way to get your hands on half of everything than to claim your son is Ben's heir? The accusation hung between us like a gauntlet thrown down. Around us, the gathered mourners were watching with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car crash. This was going to be talked about in Whitmore for years to come. The Turner sisters' public battle at Ben Clark's funeral. You're being paranoid, Laura said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. I have DNA evidence. Then produce it, I demanded. Right now, not later, not when it's convenient, not after you've had time to manufacture more fake documents. If you have DNA evidence that proves Jason is Ben's son, then show it to me this instant. Laura's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Jason was staring at his mother with a growing expression of horror, as if he was beginning to realize the implications of what she'd done. Mom, he said quietly, you do have the test results, right? You said Ben, you said he arranged for the testing. Of course I have them, Laura snapped, but she was looking increasingly cornered. They're with my lawyer at the church. Then let's go to the church, I said firmly. Right now. Everyone here can witness the evidence, and we can settle this once and for all. It was a bluff, and I think we all knew it. If Laura really had ironclad proof that Jason was Ben's son, she wouldn't be hesitating. She wouldn't be making excuses about lawyers and documents stored elsewhere. She would have brought everything with her to maximize the impact of her revelation. But I was betting that she didn't have any real evidence at all, that this was all an elaborate con game designed to shake me down for money while I was at my most vulnerable. It was exactly the kind of thing Laura would do: take advantage of a crisis, manipulate emotions, and strike when her target was least able to defend themselves. The question was whether I was right, and whether I had the strength to call her bluff in front of all these people. "Fine," Laura said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Let's go to the church. But when I prove I'm telling the truth, I don't want to hear another word of protest from you about Jason's inheritance. And when you can't prove it," I replied evenly, "I want you to publicly apologize for disrupting my husband's funeral with your lies, and I never want to see you in this town again." The gauntlet was thrown. The battle lines were drawn. And somewhere in the middle of it all was a 16-year-old boy who was beginning to realize that his mother might have made him an unwitting accomplice in a con game that would destroy what was left of our family forever. The walk from the cemetery to St. Mark's Church Hall felt like a death march. Word had spread quickly among the mourners, and by the time we arrived, the reception room was buzzing with whispered conversations that died abruptly whenever I walked past. I could feel their eyes on me, could practically hear their thoughts. Poor Melissa. First she loses her husband, and now this. The church hall had been decorated with simple white flowers and photos of Ben from different stages of his life. There was our wedding picture on the memorial table, both of us so young and hopeful. There was Ben with his construction crew, grinning as they celebrated completing the new elementary school. There was Ben coaching Little League, surrounded by kids who adored him. Looking at those photos now, knowing what I knew, felt like looking at evidence of a lie. Had he been thinking of Jason when he coached those children? Had he been comparing them to the son he couldn't claim? The questions were eating me alive. Laura had positioned herself near the front of the room with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, silver-haired, expensive suit, her lawyer, obviously. Jason stood beside them, looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The kid kept glancing at me with an expression of pure misery, and I found myself feeling sorry for him, despite everything. "Melissa." The lawyer approached me with the practiced sympathy of someone who dealt with family disputes for a living. "I'm Robert Hartwell from Hartwell, Morrison and Associates in Billings. I'm very sorry for your loss. Cut the pleasantries, Mr. Hartwell," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "I understand you have documents that you claim prove my nephew is my husband's son and heir to half his estate." Hartwell's eyebrows rose slightly at my directness, but he nodded. "Indeed I do. Perhaps we could sit down somewhere private to discuss this matter." "No." The word came out harder than I'd meant it to. Around us, the conversation had died completely, and I realized that everyone in the room was straining to hear what was being said. My sister chose to make her accusations public at my husband's graveside. "We'll resolve this publicly as well." Laura stepped forward, her cheeks flushed with what looked like a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Melissa, there's no need to be so dramatic. This is a family matter. You made it a public matter the moment you pulled out that will at the cemetery." I shot back. "Now let's see this evidence you claim to have." Hartwell opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "Very well, if that's how you prefer to handle this." He removed several documents and spread them on the memorial table, right next to Ben's photograph. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, evidence of his alleged betrayal literally overshadowing his memory. "First," Hartwell said in his professional tone, "we have the amended last will and testament of Benjamin Robert Clark, dated September 15th of this year." He handed me the document, and I scanned it quickly. The language was dense and legal, but the meaning was clear. Half of Ben's assets were to go to Jason Benjamin Turner, my biological son. The will was notarized and appeared to have Ben's signature at the bottom, but something felt wrong about it. The signature looked right, but the handwriting on the document itself seemed slightly off, too neat, too careful, as if someone had been trying very hard to copy Ben's usual writing style. "This doesn't prove anything," I said, handing the will back. "Anyone could have forged this, which is why we also have this," Hartwell said smoothly, producing another document. "The results of a paternity test conducted by Northwest Genetics Laboratory in Seattle." My hands trembled as I took the paper. According to the test results, DNA samples had been collected from Benjamin Clark and Jason Turner and compared. The conclusion was stated in bold letters. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. The room seemed to tilt around me. This was harder to dismiss than a potentially forged will or a suspicious letter. DNA testing was science, cold and objective. If these results were legitimate, then everything Laura had said was true. When was this test conducted? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 6 weeks ago, Hartwell replied. The same day Mr. Clark signed his amended will. 6 weeks ago. I tried to remember what Ben had been doing 6 weeks ago, whether he'd made any unusual trips or appointments. He had driven to Billings for a construction conference around that time, had been gone for 2 days. Had he made a detour to Seattle? Had he met with Jason and provided a DNA sample? I want to see the chain of custody documentation, I said suddenly. Hartwell blinked. I'm sorry. The chain of custody. DNA tests are only valid if there's proper documentation showing who collected the samples, how they were stored, how they were transported to the lab. I want to see all of that paperwork. Laura was looking increasingly agitated. Melissa, you're being ridiculous. The test results speak for themselves. Do they? I was gaining confidence now, drawing on years of research skills from my job at the library. DNA tests can be manipulated. Samples can be switched. Results can be falsified. Without proper chain of custody documentation, these results are meaningless. Hartwell was flipping through his papers, looking increasingly uncomfortable. I'm afraid I don't have the custody documentation with me today. That would be stored at the laboratory. How convenient. I turned to address the room full of mourners who were hanging on every word. And so we have a will that could easily be forged, a letter with details that don't check out, and DNA test results with no verification of how the samples were collected. Does this sound like ironclad evidence to anyone? I could see doubt creeping into the faces around me. These were my friends and neighbors, people who had known Ben and me for years. They wanted to believe the best of us, wanted to think that this was all some terrible mistake. There's also the matter of the birth certificate, Hartwell said, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. What about it? Jason's birth certificate lists father unknown. However, we have this affidavit from Miss Turner stating that she deliberately left the father's name blank to protect Mr. Clark's reputation and marriage. He handed me another document, and I read it quickly. It was a sworn statement from Laura, claiming that she had kept Ben's identity secret for 16 years out of respect for our marriage, but that she felt compelled to reveal the truth now that he was gone, and Jason needed financial support for college. It was a compelling narrative, I had to admit. The grieving single mother protecting the married man she'd loved, sacrificing her own child's right to know his father to preserve a marriage. It was exactly the kind of story that would tug at heartstrings and generate sympathy. But there was one problem with it. This affidavit is dated last week, I said, looking up from the document. 3 days after Ben's accident. Yes, Hartwell said carefully. Ms. Turner felt it was finally time to tell the truth. Interesting timing. I folded the affidavit and set it down on the table. She waits 16 years to reveal this secret, and then suddenly decides to come forward just days after Ben dies in a car accident. Almost like she was waiting for him to be unable to contradict her story. That's a terrible thing to say, Laura protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? Because I'm starting to see a pattern here, Laura. You show up at Ben's funeral with a manila folder full of documents, all of them dated within the past few weeks. You make your big revelation at the cemetery where Ben can't defend himself or provide his side of the story. You've got your lawyer waiting in the wings with papers that conveniently can't be verified without additional documentation that's mysteriously unavailable. I was on a roll now, fed by anger and adrenaline and the growing suspicion that I was being played. Tell me, Laura, when exactly did you first contact Mr. Hartwell? Before or after Ben's accident? The silence that followed was deafening. Laura's face had gone pale, and she was looking at her lawyer with something that might have been panic in her eyes. I don't see how that's relevant, Hartwell said carefully. Oh, it's very relevant. Because if Laura contacted you before the accident, it would suggest she was planning this whole scheme while Ben was still alive to potentially expose her lies. But if she contacted you after the accident, I let the implication hang in the air. Ms. Turner contacted my office 4 days ago, Hartwell admitted reluctantly. 4 days ago. The day after Ben's funeral arrangements had been finalized. The day after the obituary ran in the local paper listing his assets and insurance policies. The timing was suspicious as hell. And when did she first present you with all this evidence? I pressed. She brought the documents to my office 3 days ago. 3 days ago. The same day I'd been struggling with funeral arrangements. the same day I'd been barely able to function from grief. Laura had been across the state, meeting with lawyers and plotting her inheritance grab. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Within 24 hours of my husband's death, my sister contacted a lawyer in Billings. Within 48 hours, she had assembled a complete legal case claiming her son was Ben's heir. And now she expects me to believe that this is all about revealing a long-held family secret rather than a calculated attempt to steal half of Ben's estate." The murmur of voices around the room was growing louder. People were starting to put the pieces together, starting to see the holes in Laura's story. I could see doubt and suspicion replacing the initial shock and sympathy. But Laura wasn't finished fighting. "You want proof?" she said suddenly, her voice rising with desperation. "Jason, tell her. Tell her about the birthmark." Jason looked up with startled, frightened eyes. "Mom, I don't—" "Tell her about the birthmark on your shoulder, the one that looks like a crescent moon. Tell her how Ben had the exact same birthmark in the exact same place." My blood turned to ice. Ben did have a birthmark on his left shoulder, a curved shape that I'd always thought looked like a crescent moon. I'd kissed that birthmark 1,000 times over the years, had teased him about it when we were dating. "Show her," Laura commanded. Jason shook his head, his face burning with embarrassment. "Mom, I can't just strip in a church hall. This is crazy." "It's not crazy. It's proof," Laura insisted. "Birthmarks are hereditary. The fact that you both have identical marks in identical places proves you're father and son." I felt the room starting to spin around me. The birthmark detail was specific, intimate, something that couldn't easily be faked or researched. How would Laura know about Ben's birthmark, unless she had seen him without his shirt, unless they really had been together that terrible weekend before our wedding? But then I remembered something that made my stomach clench with a different kind of realization. "Laura," I said quietly, "how do you know about Ben's birthmark?" She smiled triumphantly. "Because I saw it 17 years ago, the night Jason was conceived." "But that's not the only time you've seen it, is it?" Her smile faltered slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean you've seen Ben without his shirt on other occasions." "More recent occasions." I turned to address the room, knowing that what I was about to reveal would change everything. "You see, there's something Laura hasn't told you all, something that makes this entire story fall apart." The room was dead silent now, everyone hanging on my words. Jason was staring at me with growing confusion and fear, as if he sensed that his world was about to be shattered. 2 summers ago, Ben and I went through a rough patch. He was working long hours. I was dealing with fertility treatments that weren't working, and we were both stressed and unhappy. We decided to try a trial separation to see if some time apart would help us figure things out. I could see understanding starting to dawn on several faces around the room. My mother looked horrified, as if she knew where this was heading. Ben moved into a furnished apartment in town for 3 months. During that time, Laura came to visit. She said she was thinking about relocating back to Montana, wanted to see if there were any opportunities here. She stayed for 2 weeks. Laura's face had gone completely white now. "Melissa, don't—" "During those 2 weeks," I continued relentlessly, "Ben and Laura had an affair. Not 17 years ago, not before our wedding, but 2 years ago while we were separated. That's when she saw his birthmark. That's when Jason was conceived. If he's actually Ben's son at all." The explosion of shocked voices filled the church hall. People were turning to stare at Laura with expressions of disgust and betrayal. This wasn't a long-buried secret being revealed for the sake of a fatherless child. This was a recent betrayal being used as a weapon for financial gain. "But Jason is 16, someone called out. "If this happened 2 years ago, Jason isn't Ben's son," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the chaos. "He's just a pawn in Laura's scheme. A 16-year-old boy she's convinced to lie about his parentage so she can steal half of my husband's estate." Jason was backing away from his mother now, his face a mask of horror and betrayal. "Mom, is that true? Did you lie to me about who my father is?" Laura was looking around the room like a trapped animal, her carefully constructed story crumbling around her. I can explain. It's complicated." "No," Jason said, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's not complicated. You lied to me. You made me lie to everyone. You used me." He turned and ran from the church hall, pushing through the crowd of stunned mourners. I started to follow him, but Laura grabbed my arm. "You don't understand," she hissed. "You don't know the whole truth." "I know enough," I said, pulling away from her grasp. "I know you're a liar and a manipulator who turned your own son into an accomplice in your scheme to defraud me." Jason is Ben's son, she said desperately. The dates. I lied about the dates, but he's still Ben's child. The DNA test is real. Melissa. Ben knew the truth, and that's why he changed his will. For a moment, doubt crept back in. Could she be telling the truth about the core claim while lying about the timeline? Could Ben have discovered he was Jason's father and made provisions for him without telling me? But then I remembered something else, something that had been nagging at me since Laura first made her accusations at the cemetery. Something that proved, once and for all, that this was nothing but an elaborate con game, and it was time to reveal my own secret, the one that would destroy Laura's story forever. The church hall had erupted into chaos. People were talking over each other, some trying to comfort me, others confronting Laura, and a few heading for the door as if they couldn't bear to witness any more of this family destruction. But I stood perfectly still in the center of it all, feeling a strange calm settle over me as I prepared to reveal the truth that would end this nightmare once and for all. "Everyone, please," I said, raising my voice above the din. "Everyone, please be quiet. There's something else you all need to hear." The room gradually fell silent, all eyes turning back to me. Laura was standing near the memorial table, her face a mask of desperation and growing panic. Her lawyer was quietly packing up his papers, clearly wanting to distance himself from what was rapidly becoming a public relations disaster. "Laura has been very creative with her story," I began, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions inside me. "She's presented documents, DNA tests, intimate details about my husband's body. She's even convinced her own son that he's the child of a man he barely knew. But there's one small problem with her entire narrative." I paused, looking around the room at all the faces I'd known for years. Ben's co-workers, our neighbors, friends from church, family members who'd traveled hundreds of miles to pay their respects. These people deserved the truth, all of it. The problem is that Ben couldn't possibly be Jason's father. Not 17 years ago, not 2 years ago, not ever. And the reason I know this with absolute certainty is because Benjamin Clark was sterile. The words dropped into the silence like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of shock through the gathered crowd. Laura's face went completely white, and she actually swayed on her feet as if the revelation had physically staggered her. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Is it?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope of my own, one I'd been carrying for 3 years, hoping someday I'd have the courage to share its contents with Ben. These are the medical records from Ben's fertility specialist, Dr. Patricia Williamson in Billings. Tests conducted 3 years ago when we were still trying to have children. I opened the envelope and removed several official-looking documents. The tests were comprehensive. Sperm count, motility, genetic screening, everything. The results were unambiguous. Ben had been sterile since childhood, the result of a severe case of mumps when he was 12 years old. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see people's minds working, processing the implications of what I'd just revealed. If Ben was sterile, then every aspect of Laura's story fell apart like a house of cards. But that's not the worst part," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "The worst part is that Ben never knew. Dr. Williamson gave me the results privately after Ben had already left for a work trip. She wanted to discuss options for breaking the news gently, wanted to prepare him for the psychological impact. But Ben was killed in that car accident before I could tell him." I looked directly at Laura and saw my own pain reflected in her horrified expression. "So you see, Laura, when you stood up at my husband's graveside and announced that he was Jason's father, you weren't just lying about Ben. You were destroying the memory of a man who spent the last months of his life believing he'd fathered a child he'd never known, a guilt that was eating him alive for something that was physically impossible." "No," Laura said, shaking her head frantically. "The DNA test, the laboratory results, are fake," I said flatly. "And just like the will, just like the letter, just like everything else you've presented today. You hired someone to forge Ben's signature on documents, you paid someone to create false DNA results, and you coached your son to lie about intimate details he couldn't possibly know." I held up one of the medical documents. "Dr. Williamson is here today, actually. She drove down from Billings for the funeral." I nodded toward a middle-aged woman standing near the back of the room. "Doctor, would you mind confirming the test results for everyone?" Dr. Williamson stepped forward reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of this revelation. "I'm sorry, Melissa. I know this is painful. But yes, the tests were conclusive. Benjamin suffered from azoospermia, a complete absence of sperm. It's not uncommon following severe mumps infections in adolescence. There was no possibility of natural conception. The room exploded again, but this time the voices were angry, directed at Laura. People were calling her despicable, a fraud, a woman who would exploit her own child for money. Several of Ben's co-workers were advancing on her with expressions that made me genuinely worry for her safety. "Wait," I said, raising my hand for silence again. "There's more." Laura was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in black streams. "Melissa, please, I can explain." "Can you explain this?" I pulled out another document, this one crisp and official. "This is a receipt from Hartwell, Morrison & Associates, dated 5 days ago, a payment of $5,000 for initial legal consultation and document preparation services. $5,000, Laura." "Where exactly did you get that kind of money?" Her lawyer had gone very still, his face pale with what looked like professional embarrassment. This was clearly the first time he was hearing about the fraud aspects of the case he'd agreed to take on. "And this," I continued, producing another paper, "is a credit report I pulled on you yesterday after you made your accusations. It shows that 3 weeks ago, you took out a cash advance of $7,000 against your credit cards. $7,000 that you've apparently spent on forged documents, fake DNA tests, and legal fees for a fraudulent inheritance claim." The evidence was overwhelming now, a paper trail that connected Laura's financial desperation to her elaborate scheme. I could see the realization dawning on faces around the room. This wasn't a family secret being revealed. It was a calculated crime being exposed. "But the birthmark," someone called out. "She knew about Ben's birthmark." "Yes, she did," I agreed. "Because 2 years ago, during our trial separation, Ben and Laura did have an affair. She wasn't lying about that part. She saw his birthmark then, and she's been using that intimate knowledge to add credibility to her lies about Jason's parentage." I turned back to Laura, who was now sobbing openly. "The affair happened, didn't it, Laura? But there was no pregnancy, no child conceived. You just took that real memory and wrapped a fake story around it, gambling that I'd be too devastated by Ben's death to fight back effectively. It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered through her tears. "I was desperate, Melissa. I'm drowning in debt. Jason needs money for college. I lost my job last month. I saw the obituary mentioning the life insurance and the house, and I just thought, you thought you could steal half of everything my husband worked for by convincing people he'd fathered your child." I finished. "You thought you could exploit my grief and Ben's death for your own financial gain." The room had gone deadly quiet again. Even the most sympathetic faces were now looking at Laura with disgust and contempt. This wasn't a woman trying to secure her child's rightful inheritance. This was a predator who had waited for her sister's husband to die before launching an elaborate fraud scheme. "Jason doesn't know," she said suddenly, looking up at me with desperate eyes. "Please, Melissa, he doesn't know it was all fake. He really believes Ben was his father. When I told him, when I showed him the forged letter, he was so happy to finally know who his father was. Please don't destroy that for him." I felt a stab of sympathy for the boy who had run from the church hall in shame and confusion. Jason really was an innocent victim in all of this, manipulated by his own mother into believing a lie that had briefly given him the father he'd always longed for. "Where is Jason's real father?" I asked. Laura's sobs grew harder. "I don't know. There were several possibilities around the time he was conceived. I never tried to find out for sure." The admission hung in the air like an accusation. Jason wasn't just the victim of a recent fraud. He was the product of a lifestyle that had left his paternity genuinely uncertain. Laura had used her own promiscuity as cover for her lies, knowing that the confusion around Jason's parentage would make her claims harder to disprove. "Mr. Hartwell," I said, turning to the lawyer who was looking like he wanted to disappear entirely. "I assume you'll be withdrawing from this case and reporting the fraud to the appropriate authorities." He nodded quickly. "Absolutely. Mrs. Turner, I'll be refunding your retainer and terminating our attorney-client relationship effective immediately. I strongly suggest you retain criminal defense counsel." Criminal defense counsel. The words hit Laura like a physical blow, and she sank into one of the folding chairs set up for the reception. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in. She wasn't just facing public humiliation. She was facing potential jail time for fraud, forgery, and who knew what other charges. "Melissa," my mother said quietly, appearing at my side, "what do you want to do about all this?" It was a good question. I could press charges, could make sure Laura faced the full legal consequences of what she'd done. I could make her pay for disrupting Ben's funeral, for humiliating me in front of our entire community, for using her own son as a weapon in her scheme. But I was also tired, bone deep, soul-crushing tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind the familiar ache of grief and loss. Ben was still dead, our dreams were still shattered, and nothing Laura did or didn't do was going to change that. "I want her gone," I said finally. "I want her and Jason out of this town tonight, and I never want to see either of them again. If she agrees to that, and makes a public apology for what she's put everyone through today, I won't press charges." It was more mercy than Laura deserved, and we all knew it. But Jason didn't deserve to have his mother go to prison on top of everything else he was dealing with. The kid had been through enough trauma for one day, and the money she's already spent on this scheme? Dr. Williamson asked practically. I looked at Laura, slumped in her chair like a broken doll. "And keep it," I said. "Consider it payment for teaching me who my sister really is. That's knowledge worth $7,000. Laura looked up at me with something that might have been gratitude mixed with shame. "Melissa, don't," I cut her off. "Don't apologize. Don't explain. Don't try to justify what you did. Just gather what's left of your dignity, find your son, and leave. Tonight." She nodded wordlessly and stood up on unsteady legs. As she walked toward the door, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, no one wanting to be contaminated by association with what she'd done. Just before she reached the exit, she turned back one last time. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "Ben really did love you more than anything. The guilt over our affair was killing him. He was planning to confess everything when he got back from that construction conference. Then she was gone, leaving behind a room full of people trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The funeral reception that should have been a celebration of Ben's life had turned into a courtroom drama that exposed family secrets and criminal behavior. It would be talked about in Whitmore for decades to come, but as I stood there surrounded by friends and neighbors who were offering comfort and support, I realized something had changed inside me. The crushing weight of betrayal and humiliation was lifting, replaced by something I hadn't felt in days: strength. I had faced down my sister's lies and exposed her fraud in front of everyone who mattered to me. I had defended Ben's memory and my own dignity. I had protected an innocent teenager from his mother's schemes, even though it cost me the satisfaction of seeing full justice done. And most importantly, I had learned the truth about Ben's condition, truth that, ironically, proved how much he really had loved me. He'd spent years blaming himself for our inability to have children, never knowing that the problem was medical rather than personal. He'd carried guilt over an affair that had produced no lasting consequences beyond his own self-recrimination. Ben hadn't betrayed our marriage by fathering another woman's child. He'd been faithful to me in all the ways that truly mattered, and he died still believing he was a failure as a husband. That knowledge broke my heart and healed it at the same time. As the crowd began to disperse and people started the process of cleaning up the church hall, I found myself standing alone by the memorial table, looking at Ben's pictures. The photos showed a man who had lived fully and loved deeply, who had made mistakes but tried to make them right, who had died too young but had left behind a legacy of kindness and integrity. "He was a good man, Melissa," Dave Thompson said, appearing at my shoulder. Whatever happened between him and your sister, it didn't define who he was." "I know," I said, and for the first time since the accident, I really meant it. He was the best man I ever knew. And as I stood there in the church hall where we'd held our wedding reception 10 years earlier, surrounded by the people who had loved Ben and supported our marriage, I finally began to believe that someday, maybe not soon, but someday, I was going to be okay. 3 months had passed since that terrible day at the cemetery, and spring was finally beginning to show its face in Whitmore. The oak tree that Ben had planted in our front yard was budding with new leaves, and I found myself watching it from the kitchen window as I drank my morning coffee. It had become a ritual of sorts, this quiet moment before the day began, when I could think about Ben without the crushing weight of grief threatening to pull me under. The house felt different now. Not empty, exactly, but peaceful in a way it hadn't been for years. I'd spent the winter months going through Ben's things, sorting through memories and making decisions about what to keep and what to let go. His construction boots still sat by the back door. I couldn't bring myself to move them yet, but his clothes had been donated to the local shelter, and his tools had been given to the high school's woodworking program. He would have liked that. I'd also spent those months in therapy, working through the trauma of that day, and the complicated emotions surrounding Ben's affair with Laura. Dr. Sarah Chen, a counselor in Billings, had helped me understand that grief isn't linear, that anger and love can coexist, that healing doesn't mean forgetting. Ben made a mistake, she told me during one of our sessions. But one mistake doesn't erase 17 years of love and commitment. You're allowed to be angry about the affair and still mourn the man he was most of the time. It had taken me weeks to internalize that wisdom, to stop swinging between idealizing Ben's memory and vilifying it. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in the middle. He'd been a good man who'd made a bad choice during a difficult period in our marriage. That choice had consequences: guilt that ate at him, trust that needed rebuilding, a relationship that required work to repair. But we'd been working on it, slowly and carefully, right up until that drunk driver stole our chance to finish the job. The doorbell rang, interrupting my morning reverie. I glanced at the clock. 8:30 a.m., too early for most visitors. Through the front window, I could see a tall, lanky figure on my porch, hands shoved deep in jacket pockets in a gesture that was achingly familiar. Jason. I hadn't seen him since that awful day at the church, though I'd heard through the Whitmore grapevine that he and Laura had indeed left town that night. Word was they'd moved back to Seattle, where Laura had supposedly found another job. I'd wondered how the boy was coping with the revelation that his entire understanding of his parentage had been built on lies. I opened the door to find him looking older than his 17 years, his face drawn with the kind of weariness that comes from having your world turned upside down. He was wearing a worn denim jacket and scuffed sneakers, and he looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. "Hi, Aunt Melissa," he said quietly. "I hope it's okay that I came. I know my mom said we weren't supposed to contact you, but I wanted to. Come in," I said, stepping aside. "You look like you could use some coffee." He followed me into the kitchen, glancing around at the space with curious eyes. It occurred to me that in all the years I'd been married to Ben, Jason had never actually been inside our house. Laura's visits had always been brief and centered around restaurants or hotel meetings. She'd claimed our guest room wasn't suitable for a growing teenager. Now I wondered if she'd simply been afraid to let him get too comfortable here, afraid he might start asking questions about the man she'd claimed was his father. "How are you doing?" I asked, pouring him a cup of coffee and adding the cream and sugar I remembered he preferred. He wrapped his hands around the mug like it was an anchor. "Not great, honestly. Mom and we haven't been talking much since we got back to Seattle. She's been trying to pretend like none of it ever happened, like we can just go back to normal, but I can't. That must be incredibly difficult. The worst part is that I don't know what's true anymore," he said, staring into his coffee. "For 16 years, I had no idea who my father was. Then for 3 months, I thought it was Ben, Uncle Ben, and I was so happy, you know. I felt like I finally belonged somewhere, like I had a connection to something bigger than just me and Mom." His voice cracked slightly, and I felt my heart break for him all over again. This boy had been used as a pawn in his mother's scheme, had his emotions manipulated for financial gain, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered identity. "And now I'm back to not knowing," he continued. "Mom still won't tell me the truth about who my real father is. She just keeps saying it's complicated, that some things are better left in the past. But I'm 17, Aunt Melissa. I'm old enough to handle complicated." I sat down across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where Ben and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations over the years. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," he said immediately. "The truth about that weekend before your wedding, the truth about the affair during your separation, the truth about who my father really is. I'm tired of living in the dark." I took a deep breath, considering how much to tell him. On one hand, he was still a minor, still Laura's son, and I had no legal right to interfere in their relationship. On the other hand, he'd been through hell because of his mother's lies, and he deserved some honesty in his life. "The weekend before my wedding," I began carefully, "Ben and I did have a terrible fight, and Laura was in town. But nothing happened between them that weekend. Jason, I'm certain of that now." "How can you be certain?" "Because I talked to Ben's best man, Mike Rodriguez, after the funeral. He was with Ben that entire weekend. They went fishing up at Glacier Lake, stayed in a cabin with 3 other guys. There are photos, witnesses, receipts. Ben never even saw Laura during her visit." Jason's shoulders sagged with what looked like relief. "So the story about me being conceived then was completely made up. Completely. Your mother used that fight as a framework for her lies, because she knew it was a painful memory that I might not examine too closely. And the affair during your separation 2 years ago? This was harder to talk about, the wound still tender despite the healing I'd done. That did happen. Ben and Laura did sleep together during our trial separation. But Jason, you're 17. The math doesn't work. He nodded slowly. I know. I figured that out pretty quickly once the shock wore off. So if Ben isn't my father, and the conception story was fake, then who? I don't know, I said honestly. Your mother claims there were multiple possibilities around the time you were conceived, and she never tried to determine paternity definitively. The pain that flickered across his face was heartbreaking. To learn that your existence was the result of such carelessness, that your mother couldn't even narrow down your parentage to a specific person. It was a burden no teenager should have to carry. I've been thinking about getting a DNA test done myself, he said quietly. And there are those ancestry websites where you can upload your genetic information and potentially find relatives. Maybe I could track down my father that way. That's your choice to make, I said carefully. But Jason, I want you to consider something. Your father, your biological father, might not be someone who wants to be found. He might not even know you exist. And if you do find him, he might not be the man you're hoping for. I know, he said. But I have to try, you know. I can't keep living with this giant question mark hanging over my entire existence. I understood that completely. The need to know who you are, where you come from, what your story really is, those are fundamental human needs. Jason had been denied that knowledge his entire life, and then briefly given false answers that had been cruelly snatched away. There's something else I wanted to tell you, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. I brought this back. He pulled out the forged letter that Laura had claimed was from Ben. The one that had been so convincing with its perfect handwriting and intimate details. The paper looked more worn now, as if it had been handled many times. I know it's fake, he said, setting it on the table between us. But for those few weeks when I believed it was real, it meant everything to me. Having a father who cared about me, who was proud of me, who regretted not being part of my life, even if it was all a lie. It felt good. I looked at the letter, remembering how perfectly it had captured Ben's voice and mannerisms. Laura had been thorough in her deception. I had to give her that. Ben would have been proud of you, I said suddenly. Mare, if he had known you, really known you, not as part of some scheme, he would have thought you were a remarkable young man. How can you say that? You barely know me. I know that when your mother tried to use you as a weapon against me, you were uncomfortable with it. I know that when you realized the scope of her lies, you felt guilty even though none of it was your fault. I know that you came here today to try to make things right, even though it would have been easier to just disappear and never face me again. I reached across the table and touched his hand gently. Those are the actions of someone with integrity, Jason. Someone with a moral compass that works even when the adults around him have lost their way. Ben would have recognized that in you, and he would have been proud. Tears were starting to form in his eyes, and he wiped them away with his free hand. Thank you for saying that. I've been feeling like such a fraud, like I helped destroy your husband's funeral and humiliate you in front of the whole town. You were manipulated by someone you trusted completely, I said firmly. That's not your fault, and it doesn't make you a fraud. It makes you a victim. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, drinking our coffee and processing the weight of everything that had been said. Outside, I could hear the sounds of Whitmore waking up, cars starting, dogs barking, the distant hum of the school bus making its rounds. What are your plans now? I asked eventually. I graduate in 2 months, he said. I've been accepted to the University of Washington for fall, assuming I can figure out how to pay for it. Mom's still struggling financially, and obviously the whole inheritance scheme didn't work out. I'd been thinking about this conversation for months, ever since that day at the church when I'd watched a confused teenager realize his mother had used him as a pawn. Jason wasn't my responsibility, legally or morally, but he was family in the complicated way that families work. And Ben, whatever his flaws, wouldn't have wanted an innocent kid to suffer for his mother's crimes. I have a proposition for you, I said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. Ben had a life insurance policy that paid out when he died. It's more money than I need to live comfortably for the rest of my life. What would you say to me setting up a college fund for you? His eyes widened in shock. Aunt Melissa, I can't accept that. Not after what Mom did to you. This has nothing to do with your mother, I said firmly. This is about you, and the fact that you deserve a chance to build a life that isn't defined by her mistakes. It's also about Ben, and the kind of man he was. He believed in helping kids reach their potential. That's why he coached Little League. Why he volunteered at the high school. He would want me to do this. But it's so much money. Money that's just sitting in the bank earning interest while I figure out what to do with the rest of my life, I said. I can't think of a better use for it than helping a good kid get an education. Jason was quiet for a long time, staring out the kitchen window at Ben's oak tree. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. There's a condition, he said. If you're really willing to do this for me, then I want to earn it. Not just take it as charity, but work for it somehow. What did you have in mind? Let me help you with projects around the house, yard work, whatever needs doing. I can drive down from Seattle on weekends, spend holidays here if you want the company. Let me be useful. Let me contribute something. The offer touched me more than I could express. This boy, who had every reason to be bitter and angry, was offering to spend his free time helping the woman his mother had tried to defraud. It was grace and maturity beyond his years. I'd like that very much, I said, but only if you promise me something in return. What's that? Promise me you'll stop calling me Aunt Melissa. We're not related by blood, and after everything that's happened, the title feels too formal. Just call me Melissa, or Mel if you want. That's what Ben called me. A smile broke across his face, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all morning. Okay, Mel, it's a deal. We shook hands across the kitchen table, sealing an agreement that felt like the beginning of something new and hopeful. Not a replacement for the family he'd lost when Laura's lies were exposed, and not a substitute for the father he'd never known, but something real and honest and built on mutual respect. As Jason prepared to leave, he had to catch a bus back to Seattle that afternoon. I walked him to the front door. On the porch, he turned back for one last look at the house where he'd hopefully spend many weekends over the next few years. Mel, he said, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you think you'll ever forgive my mother for what she did? It was a question I'd been asking myself for months, working through in therapy, and in the quiet moments when grief gave way to anger. The easy answer was no. What Laura had done was unforgivable. She'd exploited my grief, humiliated me publicly, used her own child as a weapon, and committed fraud in the process. But the complicated answer was more nuanced. I don't know, I said honestly. Forgiveness isn't something that happens overnight, and it's not something I owe her just because she's family. But I'm working on letting go of the anger, because carrying it around is hurting me more than it's hurting her. He nodded thoughtfully. That's probably healthier than what I'm doing. What are you doing? Refusing to speak to her unless she tells me the truth about my father. It's been 3 months of silent treatments and slammed doors. We're both miserable, but I'm too stubborn to give in. I recognize that stubbornness. It was a Turner family trait, passed down through generations like eye color or height. Laura and I had both inherited it from our father, and apparently it had skipped Jason's generation as well. Maybe, I said carefully, there's a middle ground. Maybe you can't forgive her for the lies, but you can have a relationship with her anyway. She's still your mother, Jason, flawed and manipulative and capable of terrible judgment, but still the woman who raised you and loved you in her own complicated way. Did Ben forgive her? For the affair, I mean? Another complicated question. I think he was trying to. We both were. Marriage isn't a fairy tale, Jason. People make mistakes, hurt each other, disappoint each other. The question isn't whether you can avoid those things. It's whether you can work through them when they happen. And you two were working through it. We were trying. We'll never know if we would have succeeded, but we were both committed to the effort. That has to count for something. Jason hugged me goodbye. A quick, awkward embrace that still managed to convey genuine affection. As I watched him walk down the street toward the bus stop, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope for the future. Not just hope for Jason's future, though I was genuinely excited to see what he'd do with his college opportunity, but hope for my own future as well. For the first time since Ben's death, I could imagine a life that wasn't defined entirely by loss and grief. A life that included new relationships, new purposes, new reasons to get up in the morning. That evening, I called my mother in Billings and told her about Jason's visit and the college fund arrangement. She was supportive but worried, concerned that I was taking on too much responsibility, that I was trying to fill the void left by Ben's death with a surrogate family member. Maybe, I admitted, but even if that's partly true, it doesn't make it a bad decision. Jason needs help, and I need purpose. Maybe we can help each other. What about Laura? Mom asked. How do you think she'll react to this arrangement? I don't know. And frankly, I don't care, I said. Jason is almost 18. He gets to make his own choices about who he wants in his life. If Laura doesn't like it, she can deal with that however she wants. 3 weeks later, I got my answer about how Laura felt about the arrangement. Jason called me on a Saturday morning, his voice tight with stress. "She's furious," he said without preamble. "She says you're trying to steal me away from her, that you're using the money to manipulate me into choosing your side over hers. And what do you think? I think she's scared," he said after a moment. "Scared that if I have another adult in my life who treats me with respect and honesty, I'll realize how messed up our relationship really is." It was a perceptive observation from a young man who was still learning to trust his own judgment. Laura was indeed scared of losing the one person who had always been unconditionally on her side, even when her choices were questionable. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want to take the deal," he said firmly. "I want to go to college. I want to spend weekends helping you around the house. And I want to have at least one adult relationship in my life that isn't built on lies and manipulation. Then that's what we'll do, even if it makes things harder with my mom." "Jason," I said gently, "your relationship with your mother is between you and her. I'm not trying to replace her or compete with her. I'm just trying to be a consistent, honest presence in your life. If that threatens her, then she needs to figure out why." Over the following months, Jason and I settled into a comfortable routine. He'd drive down from Seattle every other weekend, helping me with projects around the house and yard. We painted the guest bedroom, planted a vegetable garden, and tackled the accumulated clutter of 17 years of marriage. It was therapeutic work, the kind of purposeful activity that helps process grief and build toward a future. We also talked about Ben, about Laura, about the complicated nature of family relationships, about Jason's plans for college and career, his hopes and fears about the future, about my own process of rebuilding a life as a widow, figuring out who I was when I wasn't half of a couple. The boy was good company, thoughtful, funny, surprisingly wise for his age. He had Ben's work ethic and integrity, but also a sensitivity that came from having navigated a complicated relationship with his mother from an early age. He understood emotional complexity in a way that many teenagers don't. 6 months after that first visit, Jason called with news that changed everything. "I got the results back from the Ancestry DNA test," he said, his voice shaking with excitement and nervousness. "And I have a match, a close match, someone who shares enough DNA to be a half-brother." My heart started pounding. After all this time, all the uncertainty and false starts, Jason might finally have found a real connection to his biological father. "What do you know about him?" "His name is Michael Torres. He's 23 and he lives in Portland. I sent him a message through the website, explained the situation. He wrote back this morning." Jason paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. "Melissa, he thinks our father is a man named David Torres, his dad. And here's the thing. David Torres was living in Seattle 18 years ago. He was working as a bartender at a place called Murphy's Pub." Murphy's Pub. I knew that name from Laura's stories about her wild 20s, the years before Jason was born, when she'd been club hopping and bar crawling her way through Seattle's nightlife scene. "Have you told your mother about this?" I asked. "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first, get your advice about how to handle it. Should I confront her with what I've found, or should I try to contact David Torres directly?" It was a delicate situation. Laura had spent 17 years refusing to reveal Jason's paternity, claiming it was too complicated to explain. Now Jason had potentially found the answer on his own, through science and determination, rather than maternal honesty. "I think," I said carefully, "that you should give your mother one more chance to tell you the truth. Show her the DNA results, tell her about Michael Torres, and ask her directly if David Torres is your father. And if she still won't tell me, then you contact David Torres yourself. You're 18 now, Jason. You don't need your mother's permission to learn about your own parentage." The conversation happened 2 days later. Jason called me from Seattle, his voice a mixture of vindication and sadness. "She admitted it," he said. "David Torres is my father. They had a brief relationship when she was working as a hostess at Murphy's Pub. When she found out she was pregnant, he'd already moved back to Portland and she decided not to tell him. How do you feel about that?" "Angry," he said immediately. "She could have told me this 17 years ago. I could have grown up knowing my father, having a relationship with him. Instead, she let me believe I was some nameless mistake, and then she tried to use me as a weapon in her scheme against you." I understood his anger completely. Laura's pattern of lies and manipulation had robbed Jason of fundamental knowledge about himself. had shaped his entire understanding of his identity around deception and uncertainty. "Are you going to contact David Torres?" I asked. "Michael, my half-brother, already did. He told his dad about me, showed him the DNA results. David wants to meet me, Melissa. He's driving up to Seattle this weekend." The excitement in Jason's voice was unmistakable, and it made my heart sing. After years of uncertainty and months of devastating revelations, he was finally going to get some real answers about where he came from. "I'm happy for you," I said, and I meant it completely. "There's more," he said. "David has been married for 15 years. I have a stepmother named Carmen and 2 younger half-sisters. A real family. Melissa. People who want to know me. A real family." The words hit me with unexpected force, reminding me that Jason was about to have something I'd never been able to give Ben. The joy of discovering new family connections, the expansion of love and belonging that comes with adding new people to your circle. But instead of sadness, I felt overwhelming happiness for this young man who deserved all the love and family connections the world could offer. "That's wonderful, Jason. Really wonderful. I know this changes things," he said quickly. "I know I'll probably be spending more time in Portland now, getting to know David and his family, but I still want to keep our arrangement. Still want to help you around the house and have you help with college expenses. You're important to me, Melissa. Your family, too. Family." The word had taken on new meaning over the past year. Not just the people you're related to by blood or marriage, but the people who choose to show up for you, who offer support without expecting anything in return, who love you not because they have to, but because they want to. "You're family to me, too," I said, tears starting to form in my eyes. "And I'm not going anywhere." As we talked about the logistics of his upcoming meeting with David Torres, I found myself thinking about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. Laura's elaborate fraud scheme had been designed to destroy my peace and steal my husband's legacy. Instead, it had led to truth being revealed, justice being served, and new relationships being formed. Jason had his real father now, and a whole new family to explore. I had a surrogate nephew who brought purpose and joy to my healing process. Even Laura, in her own way, might eventually benefit from having her web of lies finally unraveled, though that healing would be her own journey to navigate. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and watching the oak tree in my front yard. It was late summer now, and the tree was full and green, providing shade for the flower beds Ben and I had planted years earlier. In a few months, the leaves would turn brilliant colors and then fall, making way for winter's rest and spring's renewal. The cycle of seasons had become a metaphor for my own healing process. The death of winter, the gradual awakening of spring, the full bloom of summer, the graceful letting go of fall. I was somewhere in late summer now, I thought, not fully healed, but no longer in the depths of grief, ready for whatever transitions lay ahead. My phone rang, interrupting my reverie. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer anyway. "Hello? Is this Melissa Turner?" The voice was unfamiliar, older, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Yes, this is Melissa. My name is David Torres. I'm calling about Jason." My heart started pounding. Jason's biological father was calling me directly, though I couldn't imagine why. "Jason mentioned that you've been helping him with college plans," David continued. "I wanted to thank you for that, and to let you know that I'd like to contribute to his education as well. I have 18 years of child support to make up for." The generosity of the gesture, from a man who'd just learned he had a son, who owed me nothing, who could have easily resented my involvement in Jason's life, was overwhelming. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Torres, but you don't need to." "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "Jason is my son. I should have been supporting him all along, and the fact that I wasn't isn't his fault or yours. It's his mother's fault for not telling me about him, but that doesn't change my responsibility now." We talked for another 20 minutes about Jason's college plans, his personality, his hopes for the future. David Torres sounded like a good man, stable, family-oriented, eager to build a relationship with the son he'd never known he had. Jason was going to be fine, I realized. Better than fine, actually. He was going to be loved and supported by multiple families who all wanted what was best for him. As the seasons turned and Jason started his freshman year at the University of Washington, he divided his time between Seattle, Portland, and Whitmore. He spent weekends with David's family, getting to know his half-sisters and building a relationship with his father. He spent school breaks with me, tackling projects around the house and sharing stories about his classes and new friends. And gradually, slowly, he began rebuilding a relationship with his mother, one based on clearer boundaries and more honest communication. Laura and I never reconciled, and I was okay with that. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness. Some relationships are too damaged to repair. But we found a way to coexist peacefully for Jason's sake, communicating through him when necessary but otherwise maintaining our distance. 2 years later, I was working in my garden when Jason's car pulled into the driveway. He was home for Thanksgiving break, and I'd been looking forward to his visit. At 20, he'd grown into a confident young man, studying engineering and working part-time at a nonprofit that helped disadvantaged kids access educational resources. But as he walked toward me, I could see something was different. There was a lightness in his step, a glow in his face that I'd never seen before. "Melissa," he said, wrapping me in a bear hug. "I have news. Good news, I hope. The best news. I'm engaged." He pulled back to show me a small velvet box, grinning from ear to ear. "Her name is Sophia. She's a pre-med student at UWE, and she's amazing. Smart, funny, kind. You're going to love her." As he told me about Sophia, how they'd met in a study group, how she'd supported him through the complicated process of building relationships with both sides of his family, how she'd said yes when he'd proposed during a weekend trip to the San Juan Islands, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and joy. This young man who had started as an unwitting pawn in his mother's scheme had grown into someone capable of healthy love and committed relationships. He'd taken the chaos and betrayal of his origins and used them as fuel to build something beautiful and authentic. "When do I get to meet her?" I asked. "Actually," he said, looking slightly nervous, "I was hoping she could join us for Thanksgiving dinner. If that's okay with you." "Of course it's okay. I can't wait to meet the woman who's captured your heart." That Thanksgiving was one of the best I'd had in years. Sophia turned out to be everything Jason had described: warm, intelligent, with a quick sense of humor and genuine affection for the young man she'd agreed to marry. Over dinner, she told stories about Jason's study habits, obsessively organized, and his cooking attempts, enthusiastic but dangerous, while he blushed and protested, and clearly basked in her loving attention. Watching them together, I thought about Ben, and how much he would have enjoyed this moment. He would have loved Jason's engineering stories and Sophia's plans for medical school. He would have asked David Torres about his construction business when Jason called to share the engagement news with his Portland family. He would have been proud to be part of this extended, complicated, loving network of people who had all come together to support one young man's journey to adulthood. After dinner, as Jason and Sophia walked hand in hand around the neighborhood to work off the turkey and pie, I found myself back in the kitchen, cleaning dishes and thinking about the strange ways life unfolds. 3 years earlier, I'd been a grieving widow humiliated at her husband's funeral by false accusations and fraudulent schemes. Now I was a surrogate aunt preparing to help plan an engagement party for a young man who'd become one of the most important people in my life. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. There had been months of therapy, moments of crushing loneliness, days when grief threatened to pull me back into the darkness. But somehow, through the work of healing and the grace of unexpected relationships, I'd found my way to something resembling happiness again. Not the same happiness I'd shared with Ben. That was irreplaceable. A chapter of my life that had ended with his death. But a different kind of happiness, built on different foundations. The joy of mentoring a young person, the satisfaction of honest relationships, the peace that comes from surviving betrayal and choosing love over bitterness. As I finished the dishes and turned off the kitchen lights, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me was older than the one who'd stood at Ben's graveside 3 years earlier, with more gray in her hair and deeper lines around her eyes. But she was also stronger, more resilient, more confident in her ability to handle whatever challenges life might bring. Ben was gone, and I would always miss him. Laura's betrayal had left scars that would never fully heal. But out of that pain and chaos had come something unexpected and beautiful. A family built not on blood or law, but on choice and love and mutual commitment to each other's well-being. Jason and Sophia would marry the following summer, in a ceremony that brought together all the various branches of his complicated family tree. David Torres and his wife Carmen, Michael Torres and his girlfriend, Jason's half-sisters, now teenagers who adored their big brother. Even Laura, who had slowly rebuilt her relationship with her son and found a measure of peace in seeing him happy and settled. And me, standing in the front row with tears of joy streaming down my face, watching a young man I'd helped raise walk toward a future full of love and possibility. In the end, that's what healing looks like. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of new growth. Not the forgetting of old pain, but the discovery of new joy. Not the replacement of what was lost, but the creation of something entirely new and precious and worth celebrating. As I sat in that church pew, watching Jason and Sophia exchange vows, I felt Ben's presence with me in a way I hadn't experienced since his death. Not supernatural or mystical, but simply the knowledge that the love we'd shared had helped shape me into someone capable of this moment. Someone who could stand witness to new beginnings without being crushed by the weight of old endings. The oak tree in my front yard was 20 years old now, tall and strong and providing shade for a new generation of flowers. Like me, it had weathered storms and seasons, had lost branches and grown new ones, had learned to bend without breaking, and like me, it was still growing.